Would you ask Mr. Brown to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Brown, ready to carry on? Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Before the lunchtime break, we were talking about operational News 24, and you referred to the training packages that were initiated by that. Can we now turn to those particular training packages?
Yes.
Now, if we can go back to the final published version of operational News 24, it included the reference to training package on 72D visits. And if we go to LFB 00118959/4. And if we can look at the second to last red box on the page, which states in relation to 72D this, training pack available to watch officers through training support icon, Knowledge Centre, Ops News 24 watch training package. Was there mandatory training that all watches would have been expected to carry out?
Yes.
Now, the inquiry has identified TCAP 0055, entitled 72D Ops News 24, and that can be found at BAB 0000035. And if we look at the first page of this TCAP, we can see that its title refers to section 72D in Ops News 24. For the avoidance of doubt, was this the TCAP that was specifically created for the creation of the training package following on from Operational News 24?
I believe so, although I just would add that I would never normally see the TCAP, but yes, this I'm satisfied this is the correct one.
Now, if we can turn to page 8 within this document, we can see in the second box, if that could be amplified, that AC Cotton, as she then was, is listed as the commissioning officer, and DAC Mick Ellis is the client. Is it right that DAC Mick Ellis reported to you?
He did. He managed central service delivery and reported directly to me.
Is he another Ellis at the LFB? He's neither Dominic nor Graham.
No, that's correct. There was an overabundance of Ellises, and he was one of them. Yeah, Michael Ellis.
Now, if we look in the following section on page 8, which is entitled Background and Context, it's at 2.4. It states in the second paragraph in that box this: the ODCB, Operational Directorates Coordination Board, stated that it requires a CBT package regarding 72D visits following their meeting of 3rd September 2012. This requirement is driven by concerns raised by the Salamanca Place investigation over when and how 72D visits are undertaken. The concerns centre around what risk-based approach is taken to identifying buildings, including high-rise, and how it is recorded on the ORD. First of all, CBT stands for computer-based training, I think.
Yes.
Thank you. Does that summary there accord with your recollection of the concerns which motivated ODCB at the time?
I'm just going to reread it.
Please do.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, Babcock, who is the Brigade's external training provider, has provided a slideshow for this training programme. And if we can turn to BAB 0000056. There we see it's entitled 72D visits. Do you remember having cause to read these slides before they were trained out to personnel?
I didn't know, and it wouldn't be normal practice for me to do that, no.
Put colloquially, would it have been below your pay grade to review these matters?
Yeah, I would never use that terminology, but yes.
Yeah. Could we turn to page 2, on the bottom slide in particular? Now, these set out the learning objectives. And if we turn to page 6, and the bottom slide there is entitled What to Look for on a 72D Visit. Now, would you agree with me there's no reference there to the 22 items identified in the Appendix 1 to 633. Or express reference, I should say.
Yeah. There's no express reference. I mean, I'd have to go through each of those icons and think carefully about how they cross-reference with those 22. But notwithstanding that, those items aren't expressly listed. No.
Thank you. And if we could turn over the page and just go through from pages 7 onwards. Now, what we see here are a number of examples on how to calculate risk scores and what action to take based on identified risks. Now, we've gone through these, and you can go through them yourself if you'd like to, but the essential point is that the training nowhere provides any guidance on how crews should actually go about identifying risks when carrying out the visit. Now, looking at this page, would you accept that as a criticism, for example, of this slide?
Okay, can I just qualify my answer on this?
Well, if you give your answer first and then the qualification might be easiest.
Okay. No, there isn't any specific reference on here in terms of how you go about interpreting that risk. The qualification I'd like to give to that is, I think the premises risk assessment is very much a linear-based approach. So, for example, you either think there are 500 or more picnic premises or you don't. You either think there's a sleeping for 100 or there isn't. So I think what this does, it gives the opportunity for crews to practice that linear premises risk assessment. So in terms of, do I think it's satisfactory, then I think it works in terms of crews being able to apply this and then discuss their rationale after.
But in terms of telling them and training them as to how to go about, in practical terms, the 72D, would you accept it's not quite achieving that aim?
I accept your earlier proposition that it doesn't give guidance on how to complete the risk assessment, but as I say, I think that is straightforward and linear, and this gives you the opportunity to practice it. So I wouldn't agree that it doesn't meet the objective of the 72D training package in that regard.
Right, let's now look at BAB quadruple 0058. Now, as the front slide suggests, these are trainer notes for the training, which give guidance on how to deliver the training. Now, can you remember, was this training delivered by staff at station level?
I can't remember.
Would that be the usual level at which this type of training is pitched?
If it was a CBT training, there's a fair chance that this would be delivered by the watch officer in charge of that particular watch at the station.
Would the watch officers themselves have received training on how to conduct 72D visits?
Not over and above what they would have experienced as a firefighter.
Do you consider that to be a gap in the system, in the sense there is a missed opportunity to ensure consistency of approach to 72D visits by ensuring all watch officers are trained in the same way as to how to conduct them?
I don't think it's a missed opportunity in terms of should we supply training over and above for watch officers as opposed to firefighters, because I think the process doesn't distinguish between who it is that's carrying out the risk assessment. I think it matters. It matters not whether it's a firefighter or a watch officer. At the end of the day, the inspection is the inspection. So I don't see any specific issue there. I think where an opportunity was overlooked in the past is the question about what training did we give staff to do 72Ds prior to this training package. And I think up to that point, it was only initial training when joining the organisation and on-the-job training, learning as you did the inspection. So I think probably this hopefully rectified what maybe had been missed in the past. But I wouldn't I don't believe there needs to be any different training for a watch officer as opposed to a firefighter on this particular issue.
Just following on from the more procedural mechanics of the training programme, Mr. Brown, see how far you can help us on this. Could we go to BAB *000035/23? Now, if we look at the final box on that page under the heading Final Sign-Off, there appears to be no final sign-off. Now, do you know whether the training, and this TCAP concerns the 72D training programme we've just been considering, do you know whether the training was in fact provided, notwithstanding the absence here, or the apparent absence, of any final sign-off?
I believe the training was provided, yes.
What's the basis of that belief?
Because a number of things. So firstly, we've issued the publication. Secondly, we've issued the training package. But crucially, what I always would have done is seek to performance management the completion of that training. So information management were able to supply me with reports in terms of how each watch were progressing. We would red, amber and green it in terms of have they started it, have they not started it, have they completed it, and then I would report the outcomes of that to OCDB to close that loop, as it were, to demonstrate that yes, the training was required, yes, it's been provided, and yes, it's been completed.
Now, just in relation to training on how to carry out Section 72D visits, sorry to sort of belabour the point, but Danny Cotton, when she gave evidence to the inquiry at Phase 1, said that no training was provided to firefighters on how to go about conducting a visit. Is that consistent with your understanding of the position?
It's consistent with my understanding in terms of up until this point, but thereafter, then no, that's not the case.
And so your position is that this training programme remedied any previous deficiencies?
Yes.
Can I now turn to a draft email from you in relation to stations regarding the recording of high-rise premises on the ORD? And for start this line of questioning, can we go to LFB 001135599? Now, what we can see here, and if we go to the bottom half of page 2, is an email chain from November 2012, so after the publication of Policy 800 in July 2012, and around about the time I think you thought but weren't entirely sure that your involvement in Policy 800 started. Now, what we have down here is an email from David Lindridge to Richard Binder. First of all, who was Richard Binder?
Richard Binder was a group manager who worked in central service delivery and would have worked for Mick Ellis.
Now, looking at this, we have the first line, this is a message from Assistant Commissioner Ops Prevention and Response, Dave Brown, and it's for all station-based managers. And the email was headed Recording of Residential High-Rise on the Operational Risk Database. And I hope you don't mind, I'll read it out, so apologies to people having to listen to me. This message is being sent to remind station-based managers to review the risks on their station's ground, with a particular focus on the recording of residential high-rise. The quality of information held in the operational risk database is instrumental in reducing the risk our crews and the members of the public are exposed to through use of the mobile data terminals, MDTs. The publication of PN 800, Information Gathering Contingency Plans, earlier this year, gives guidance on identifying and gathering operationally important site risk information, SRI, and other supporting information, and recording it on the operational risk database. This risk-based approach allows watch and station managers to prioritise the premises on their station's ground and familiarise their crews accordingly. And now the following section is emboldened and italicised in the text of the draft. It might be useful to describe here which high-rise premises are expected to be recorded. All, ? Only those presenting additional risk, ? Only those above 149 on the scale described in PN 800. The latter will exclude most. When visiting residential high-rise premises, watch managers are encouraged to record details that would be of assistance to crews attending an incident with no prior knowledge of the building. This, and if we turn over the page, email is to remind visiting managers of the facility to add images to the ORD, which is ideal for delivering an initial understanding of the premises very quickly. The current use of this facility is not widely used and does not always deliver sufficient detail. Now, my first question is simple. Was that message drafted at your behest?
I can't recall whether I asked Dave Lindridge or whether Dave Lindridge suggested it, but what I can recall is we both agreed it was a good idea.
And if we can stop there, what was the reason, what was your reason for having the message sent?
Because of the number. If we go back a slide, if I may.
Of course, you want to go back to page 2?
Yes, please.
Excuse me.
It might be even earlier than this. I've seen this email, and I know what precedes it, so I might be thinking of what I've read in preparation for the inquiry. But there was an email exchange with Dave Lindridge that highlighted the fact that there was in the region of, I think, 250, 260 premises on the ORD, high-rise premises on the ORD. Now that was unacceptable, and this, I believe, was to re-engage, if indeed that's the right word, to push through what I wanted in terms of more premises is being put on the operation risk database. I believe that was the emphasis for this.
Is looking at the emboldened italicised words there, that's set out in the penultimate paragraph on that page, that tends to suggest that even within your team, in November 2012, there was still confusion or uncertainty about which high-rise premises were actually to be recorded on the ORD. Would you accept that?
Well, David Lindridge wasn't in my team, but notwithstanding that, I think, no, I wouldn't accept that. I think what he's doing, he's just giving me as the sender the option as to which I would want to include.
Yeah, but which of itself, given looking at the words actually used, there is an absence of certainty as to what level of detail is to be included. Would you accept that?
No, I wouldn't accept that there's a confusion over it. I think it's really just him giving the option, quite possibly because his final point, only those above 149 on the scale described in PN 800, and his comment the latter will exclude most, which I don't agree with, but maybe he just wants to remind me that if we did follow this policy, in his view, it would exclude most, and is that what I really wanted?
Well, it'd be for the panel in due course to make of that email
Sure.
what they make. But what was your response to this question? What level of detail did you require to be recorded?
Well, unless I'm about to see an email that contradicts what I'm about to say, I would have gone for the final option. So only those above 149 and a scale described in PN 800, because A, that's what we'd set out, and B, even if they were under 149, they still would have had a premises information plate attached to them, so there still would have been information about them available to arriving crews if there was an incident there, around things such as how many stairways, where they were, where the fire lift was, how many lengths of hose, water supplies, number of floors in the building. So it still would have been a useful exercise in terms of crews having on arrival information.
And I think it flows from what you've just said that I think you've said explicitly that Mr. Lindridge, you accept his view that taking the latter approach, i.e. excluding those, or rather including those above 150, would exclude most high-rise buildings.
Well, no, I don't accept that is true. I accept that might be what he believed, but I don't accept that that's a statement of fact.
Did you raise that point with him at the time, do you remember?
I don't remember, no.
Now, if we can go back to, or further up in this email chain, to the bottom half of page 1. And here we go. It's an email from Mr. Binder himself to you. And it says as follows: Gov. Regarding the issues of recording high-rise info on the ORD MDT, pre-planning at residential high-rise fires, to include single-line diagrams showing number and location of individual flats. I've spoken with Dave Wyatt, and the consensus is that since that action was required, there's been, for good reasons, a more intelligent and risk-based approach in recording operational risks to firefighters on their station's ground. This culminated in the Information Gathering Note, PN 800, and the matrix used is specific in what should be added. David Lindridge has undertook a quick trawl of the Brigade, and approx 250 high-rise premises are recorded on the ORD, of which 61 have some limited information recorded, be it a plan or a picture, with 6 having greater details, including a simple plan drawing. As it stands now, this will not fulfil the action in increasing the level of pre-planning required. Now, the high-rise database that you sent to station staff in April 2009 contained over 1,800 entries. Are you able to help us as to why there are now comparatively so few, i.e. 250 high-rise premises on the ORD 3 years later?
I can't help with certainty. I would.
If you don't know.
No, I was just going to use a professional opinion as to why it might be the case, but no, I don't know for certain. No.
Now, if we can go back to Mr. Binder's email, which in its 5th paragraph says this: the comms message below from DL, so that's David Lindridge, details how this may be achieved. The problem is that personnel might, with good reason, decide that a high-rise might not now be worthy of inclusion due to the score following use of the matrix, which could then allow the premise to be removed from the OR, which, turning over the page, we would have to accept as part of this process. However, this review will allow those that do attract inclusion will then have the single line drawings added to the premises information, as is the intention of the comms message. By approaching it this way, a review is carried out of all listed high-rise premises, and where applicable, where currently there are no single line drawings, they are then added, increasing our numbers, accepting that some premises will ultimately be removed. It may be worth putting a review deadline date if this needs to look a lot healthier by January, and sent it to area DACs and BCs, so borough commanders, to ensure this is actioned. Now, this email there refers explicitly to, quotes, the problem that personnel might with good reason decide that a high-rise might not now be worthy of inclusion because of the matrix. When would you expect a high-rise building to receive a very low score on the matrix, meaning that it would not be included on the ORD at all? Is this the paradigm model you were talking about earlier that had impressive fire suppression systems and the rest of it? Now, the inquiry has not been able to find any evidence that the draft email that we started with was in fact sent. Are you able to help us as to whether it was in fact sent?
As far as I'm aware, it was sent, yes. And the reason I say that is because I remember being disappointed with those figures and wanted to action it and make sure that we got on with increasing the numbers on the operational risk database.
Can you remember now what, if any, guidance was given with the final version of this email to essentially advise station managers on which high-rise buildings were required to be recorded on the ORD?
It would have been to follow the guidance given in Policy Note 800, and therefore carry.
Sorry, if I can stop you there. You've said in a number of answers today it would have been. My question was more direct. Was final guidance sent out with the was guidance given with the final version of the email that was sent out? Are you able to remember whether that was done?
I can't categorically state, but I can't imagine a situation where I wouldn't have sent it out. And if I did, and when I did, it would have involved Policy Note 800.
But your recollection is sure that it would have been?
Yes.
Now, can I turn to a separate but related topic, which is the Lfbs response to Porus guidance. That's P-O-R-I-S. Now, the Porus guidance was published in 2012, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you help the panel and anyone watching who may not be familiar, was the Porus guidance?
It's the provision of operational risk information system, and it was a document that was provided by the effectively central government, really, in response to a health and safety risk assessment that had been carried out on the UK Fire Service nationally. So this gave guidance that fire and rescue services should follow in terms of the kind of information that they should be collecting and how they should collect it.
Thank you. Now, can we start this line of questioning going to a report produced for the Corporate Management Board on the 27th of February 2013. That can be found at LFB 000-917-85. As you can see, it's entitled Operational Risk Information, LFB Response to National Operational Guidance. And the report summary on the front page, we can see here towards the bottom of the screen, says this: DCLG, so that's the Department of Communities and Local Government, as was, issued operational guidance on operational risk information in April 2012. This paper considers the content of that guidance and the extent to which LFB is compliant with the guidance. Now, as you've adverted to, the national guidance introduced a model approach which was called the provision of operational risk information system. And if we can look in broad terms at the substance of that model, and if we could turn to HOM 000-45364. And if we could turn to page 48, first of all. Now, Mr. Brown, the 5 stages of the Porus model are described between pages 48 and 49 here. What I'd like to do is just discuss these very briefly in headline terms so that the panel is familiar with them. And the first one we have at page 48 is stage 1, which describes itself as the initial site risk analysis process. In broad terms, am I right in thinking that this is a review of the existing information about a premises in order to determine whether a visit is required at all?
So the reason I'm just pausing is certainly it covers what you've said. I'm just trying to determine in my own mind whether it goes beyond just that initial decision.
Well, we're just talking in broad terms here, headline points about the stage. I just want to identify them because there are complexities to it, but just to give people some...
It certainly covers what you've said.
Thank you. Now, if we can turn to page 50, and here we have stage 2, which is the data gathering process. Again, broad term summary, Mr. Brown, see whether you agree with it. This is the site visit in those cases where one has been deemed necessary.
Yes.
Thank you. Turn over the page to page 51, we find stage 3, which is the detailed site risk analysis process. This involves, in broad terms again, assessment of the data that is collected during the visit at stage 2. In broad terms, is that right?
Yes.
And then the model, well, certainly the model at this stage, provides various templates as appendices that are there to assist the assessment process itself.
Yes.
Thank you. From the lay perspective, Mr. Brown, please shout if this is an undue simplification. This looks like the most important stage of the 5-stage process. Is that an accurate or sensible summary?
It's a sensible summary, yes.
Could we now turn on to page 54? Here we have stage 4, which is the risk management process. I'm putting this really simply, and hopefully not at the expense of accuracy, but this is what you do with the risk information and the assessment of risk once it's been collected. Is that fair?
Yes.
And finally, can we turn to page 58, which is the 5th and final stage, which is the incident information distribution process. Again, in broad terms, this relates to how risk information should be distributed to incident commanders for use at incidents. Is that fair?
Yes.
Thank you. Could we turn briefly over the page to page 59 and paragraph 10.44? I'll just let you familiarise yourself with that.
Okay, thank you.
In general terms, that suggests that there may be different layers of information that are required at different stages of the incident. Is that a fair overview?
Yes, and also that information applying to the arrival of resources at various stages of the incident as well.
Thank you. Now, if we can put Porus itself to one side and go back to the LFB report of February 2013, which can be found at LFB 000 91785/5. Now, just to help you, you may not have seen this document for some time, but the report is structured in tabular form, setting out the substantive point made by key paragraphs of the national guidance in the middle column, and the LFB's position is in the column on the far right-hand side. Now, if we could skip to page 20 and paragraph 33. We see here the conclusion. And again, apologies for reading this out, but it's probably easier. Paragraph 33 says this: LFB arrangements in place for the gathering of risk information appear to be robust and largely in compliance with the national operational guidance issued in April 2012. It is not considered necessary or practical to make significant adjustments to current arrangements. A few issues are highlighted for some further action, and recommendations are made. Now, before we turn to those recommendations themselves, what process did the LFB follow in arriving at the conclusion that its existing arrangements for the management of operational risk did not require significant amendment?
So this was a report completed by Information Management, so David White would have been instrumental in this. My understanding is what was presented at the Corporate Management Board was, as we saw in the previous page, a list of the areas of provision of operational risk information, and then comparisons with the various parts of our process and Policy Note 800. So it would have been a desk-based research, but would have involved discussion with those who apply the policy in terms of just, gathering information and triangulating understanding of the way the process works.
You say my understanding is what was presented at a Corporate Management Board. Were you a member of the Corporate Management Board?
I was there for this paper. I was ultimately a member of the Corporate Management Board. I can't recall exactly when I became a member, but I certainly would have been here for this paper.
Were discussions held with station-based staff to assess the practice of those on the ground?
My understanding of this is yes, it was.
For the purposes of this paper, was an audit of the ORD carried out?
I don't know on that one. Sorry, when you say an audit of the ORD, what do you mean exactly? What is
a more targeted, forensically targeted review to see whether the information recorded on the ORD, for example, in respect of high-rises, was accurate or not?
Oh, I see. I don't know, but I can't imagine what that would have added to this paper, because this was about the process.
If we could go to page 3 in this paper, and the box at the top of that page. Now, the report notes that you were consulted and gave comments on an earlier version together with a number of your colleagues. Can you help us now? Can you remember the extent of your contribution to the drafting of this report?
I can't remember. It would have been on process, but I can't remember exactly what comments I would have made. I can say, though, however, Richard Binder, as we've just discussed, was a key part of this in terms of central service delivery. And John Elwell was a borough commander who was the lead for our service standard on contingency planning. So he would have had some useful and valuable comments in regards to this. So I'd been comforted by the fact that John and Richard both commented on this paper.
We'll be coming on to Mr. Elwell in due course, as you can imagine. But did you agree with the overall conclusion that significant amendment was not required to the Lfbs processes?
Yeah, I agreed. It was broadly compliant. There were one or two issues, but it was broadly compliant.
Now, the report's recommendations are set out at pages 1 and 2 of this report. And if we can go to page 2, and it's just a limited number of recommendations I'd briefly like to discuss with you now. The first one is recommendation G, and if that could be amplified, please, thank you. And that provided, agree that an operational assurance audit review take place to identify the consistency with which stations identify sites, buildings that might present an operational risk or hazard, and compliance with policy 800 and the risk matrix. The audit review to take place after new section 72D training has been put in place and is delivered. And if we go to page 14, and the bottom row on that page, and what that says there is this. One of the challenges is how to process a very large number of sites in order to identify those where the availability of accurate, relevant and timely information may be of value at any reasonably foreseeable incident. Many buildings or risks may not require detailed site-specific information in order to expect a safe and successful outcome to operational interventions. Now, if we look rightwards, we see the Lfbs response, which was as follows. The current process, as outlined in LFB Policy 800, is regarded as adequate to identify the key buildings that are likely to present operational risks. The onus is on stations to identify risks on the station ground and to schedule regular visits if required. The risk matrix in Policy 800 provides a way of determining if a site building should appear on the ORD and the frequency of revisits. Operational news in February 2013 will also include a specific article on recording information relating to complex buildings that are likely to cause difficulties to operational staff in the event of an emergency. Now, the key question here is, do you agree with the conclusion that the Lfbs process was, quotes, adequate to identify the key buildings that are likely to present operational risks, given the problems you'd experienced over the preceding years achieving that aim?
I think the process was adequate, but undoubtedly there were issues in terms of achieving the outcome we were looking for.
In the sense you hadn't yet achieved the outcome?
Yes.
Could we go to page 15, please? And again, the bottom row. And here it deals with paragraph 8.28 of the Porus guidance, and it summarises that thus: periodic audit is a useful means to enable a deeper and more critical appraisal of the operational risk information systems and whether the system has been properly implemented and maintained and is effective in meeting organisational policies. Now, looking at the far right column, the LFB responded as follows. There are inconsistencies in the approach taken by stations about what is included on the ORD, and the quality of data capture and usage is variable. Policy 800 and the risk matrix within it is designed to improve this over time. It will be useful for the head of operational assurance to review, audit how stations identify sites, buildings that might present a risk or hazard, and the consistency of approach against Policy 800. Such an audit review should take place once the new training is in place and has been delivered. on what basis did the report conclude that there are inconsistencies in the approach taken by stations about what is included on the ORD and the quality of data capture and usage is variable?
That would have been based on the general understanding that prior to the premises risk assessment, there were premises on the central risk database, which became the operational risk database, which, when considering risk in its purest form, really shouldn't have been there. And there were other premises that clearly should have been there, and that's obvious by the basis of how many premises were on the database.
Now, given the report's finding that there were inconsistencies in approach and the recommendations for review to investigate further, mindful of that further investigation, how could the LFB, or how did the LFB conclude, before that review had in fact been carried out, that its processes were nonetheless adequate?
Because the process, as it says here, policy, so in the third line on the far right column, policy 800 and the risk matrix within it is designed to improve this over time. So because of that, and we were satisfied that we had a system in place to increase the numbers of inspections, and we had a consistent and standardised system to make sure that the appropriate premises were recorded on the ORD, we felt that the process was accurate and fit for purpose.
Well, bearing that in mind, can we go back to page 15, which is on the screen, and looking at the column on the far right-hand side, and roughly 2/3 of the way down that last box, this form of words, which I've quoted, but I'll take you to again. Such an audit review should take place once the new training is in place and has been delivered. Is the training that's been referred to here the TCAP 0055 that we were discussing earlier on?
Yes.
Why was it recommended that the audit review take place after the new Section 72D training had been put in place and delivered?
Because this was probably the first time that we'd formally trained staff in 72Ds, or certainly for some considerable time, then to allow that to bed in and allow staff to understand that training and to enhance what they're already doing. So I don't want to run away with the idea that staff didn't know how to do a 72D. They did, but this was formal training. So to allow that to bed in, and then along with Policy Note 800 and the PRA, that will be an appropriate time then to carry out this brigade-wide audit.
Could I put the point more directly? Haven't you put the cart before the horse here? Ought you to have carried out the review audit first to identify what deficiencies the training need to address?
We could have done that, but I think we accepted, following the Lachnal House Action Plan, we accepted that there were gaps in the provision of information and training we'd given to our crews. So I think we accepted that we needed to start afresh with training. So I don't think I really wanted to get involved in finding out what the gaps are. We was just doing a belt and braces approach to 72Ds, albeit in the knowledge that there was a lot of organisational knowledge at stations in terms of how to do a 72D, but then also thinking of new entrants as well. So
how do you deal with the problem? What happens if the audit review had identified yet further gaps or deficiencies in training that would have to be remedied?
Well, then that's when the dynamic, intelligent operational training kicks in, because we would find that out and we're continually looking to improve our training. So if we did find that there were further gaps, we would have amended the training course and reissued it.
But if you are to take a belt and braces approach, isn't it best done on the basis of a thorough review before any remedial training is rolled out to personnel?
Except for the fact that we accepted, after the Lachnal House Coroner's Inquiry and the pre-inquest actions that we'd put in place, that on reflection, it was an omission that this hadn't been done earlier. So we felt there was no need to carry out a review because we was going to start from square one, if you like, in terms of 7.2D training. So the only thing we risked was training some people in things that they knew exactly what to do already, but that would be a better approach in our view than it would be to potentially miss something.
I think we've probably exhausted that topic. Can we look at a separate document now, LFB 000041365? Now, this is an email exchange you would not have seen because it postdates by 9 months your retirement. It is an email exchange from December 2017 between Danny Cotton and Adrian Bevan. And you'll see that Adrian Bevan says this in the second email on that page. Sorry to bother. As part of my review of Lachnal actions, I've come across this, and I have no recollection of it myself. Do you remember it? Mr. Bevan's email then sets out what appears to be an extract of the action plan relating to X-0R17 or OR17, which replicates the text of recommendation G set out in the 2013 report, which we've just been looking at, i.e. the audit review to identify consistency of station identification of sites. Now, in the middle column, your name is crossed out, replaced with that of Danny Cotton, and the far right column says this: work by head of operational assurance to validate the work at stations, to identify and record operational risks, will need to await the embedding and outcome of work by the third officer to increase the number of visits and premises on the ORD, which is outlined in item ORI 4 above. The lead for this action should be head of operational assurance. Then if we could look at the email at the head of this chain from Danny Cotton, and she says, "Hiya, no, I don't think I've ever seen this before, and Dave Brown would definitely not have allowed us to do this." Now, the language of that email chain is clear. It suggests that the recommended audit was never carried out. Now, is that right?
There's a couple of issues here.
Well, if we can start off with an answer to the question, is it right that the audit review was not carried out?
I don't believe the audit review by operational assurance was ever carried out.
And your answer suggests it was carried out by someone else?
Yes.
Who?
So the service standards that I introduced in 2014 had a specific service standard for contingency planning, and we had structured approaches to be able to audit what was going on with regards 7.2Ds and operational contingency planning in general. So my service standard support officers would certainly have carried out audits in this regard on an annual basis from 2014 onwards.
Were those service standards designed, or were they used, actually taking it down in stages, were they designed to discharge the recommendation G, i.e. to carry out the audit review?
No.
Do you believe, or do you know, whether the audit review was in fact carried out under the umbrella of the service standard audit that you referred to?
In my opinion, that would have addressed this particular issue, yes.
I'm sorry to press you. I'm not interested, and we don't want to hear from your opinion. Was the audit review carried out? That's a fact or not? Was the audit or review carried out, envisaged by recommendation G, under the umbrella of the service standard audit procedures that you just referred to?
I never offered that up as an outcome for that particular action, no.
So when you sought to qualify your answer earlier on by saying the review audit was not carried out by ops or assurance, is it right, therefore, to take it from the evidence you've given that you don't know whether your department carried out an audit or review in following recommendation G?
Oh, no, sorry, I've misrepresented myself then. So I know that my service standard support officers did regularly audit on an annual basis a range of issues, and this would have been one of them. What I'm not suggesting is I then went forward and said, hey, that particular action in this action plan, we can tick that one off now because I've dealt with it. I never said that. I never did that. That was for operational assurance to do. And this comment in the far right column in terms of being suspended, awaiting the outcome of further work by me in terms of increasing the number of premises on there is accurate. But at some point, it would have been for the head of operational assurance to say, it's now my turn to pick this up and get on with this audit. And the reason we're both on there is because we both owned the action. Me to get the training done, me to build up the numbers on a database, and then the head of operational assurance to take over and use her staff to do the audit for which her staff were auditors.
That's a very long answer. Can I just take us back to what recommendation G was? Because I think there's a danger here of generality obscuring the particular.
Okay.
And if we go back to LFB 000-91785/2. And if we'd amplify recommendation G, it was a specific recommendation, Mr. Brown.
Mm-hmm.
Operational assurance audit review take place to identify the consistency with which stations identify sites, buildings that might present an operational risk or hazard. So the focus was on the consistency or otherwise of the approach adopted by stations to operational risk or hazard. Was there a particular audit or review that answered that specific recommendation carried out by your department?
As part of normal business, as part of this service standards, then yes. But that particular recommendation refers to joint work between Head of Operations, Prevention Response and OA. And on that respect, no, that wasn't.
Okay, thank you. Could we go back to the Cotton Bevan email correspondence, LFB 000-41365? Danny Cotton's email at the top. Dave Brown would definitely not have allowed us to do this. Can you help us to why she'd formed the view that you would not have allowed us, either LFB or Operational Assurance, to do this?
Well, first of all, that's a really disappointing comment to read, and I work closely with Operational Assurance, who did lots of audits in terms of senior accident investigations and performance reviews of command at fire stations without anything other than full cooperation from me. So I've got no idea why Danny would have suggested such a thing.
And indeed, there's nothing in the February 2013 report on Porus that suggests that you disagreed with or wasn't willing to implement recommendation G.
No, and even if I had, for some bizarre reason, wanted to stand in the way of this, which I didn't, this is a corporate action, and there is no way that I'm going to stand in way of a corporate action agreed at CMB for which I was present.
Thank you. Can we now turn to a separate topic, which is the Lachnal Rule 43 actions? Now, excuse me, if we can go back to your first statement, first of all, LFB 000-32166, page 7, and starting with paragraph 16. Now, here you set out at the bottom of the page in paragraph 16 the following. In 2013, inquests were held into the death of the 6 people who died as a result of the fire at Lachnal House. On 28th March 2013, Her Honour Francis Kirkham, CBE, Assistant Deputy Coroner, sent a letter to the Commissioner setting out her 5 recommendations for action by the LFB, Rule 43 recommendations. In my capacity as the LFB's Head of Operations, Prevention and Response, I was allocated the role of Lead Officer for Recommendation 2, which concerned visits made pursuant to Section 72D of the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004, and Recommendation 4 regarding Brigade control. I also had an involvement in Recommendation 1 in relation to public awareness, and Recommendation 3 involving incident commanders. Now, in your evidence at Module 3, Mr. Brown, Module 5 rather, I'd like to concentrate on Recommendation 2. so Section 72D visits.
Okay.
Now, the then Commissioner, Robin Dobson, wrote to the Coroner on the 23rd of May, setting out the LFB's response to her recommendations. And we can find that at LFB 000 42089. If we can go to page 4 and the second paragraph, we see there the response in relation to recommendation 2, on which you led. And really, it's the second paragraph at the top of that page says this. It is recommended that the Brigade review procedures for sharing information gained as a result of Section 72D, familiarisation, and home fire safety visits with crews both within the station in question and at other local stations. Now, in response, the Commissioner wrote at the third paragraph under the heading Response this. The Brigade's policies concerning the gathering of operational knowledge are under regular review, and many have been modified to reflect the lessons learned in the Lachnal House fires. He then continues under the heading Proposed Action this. To further enhance current systems, the Brigade will undertake a review of the existing policy relating to information gathering and contingency plans. This review will aim to optimise all of the Brigade's pre-planning activities to ensure the effective sharing of information gained as a result of Section 72D familiarisation and home fire safety visits. It will aim to maximise the use and availability of this information when operational personnel respond to emergencies. Create an inspection regime that targets high-priority residential and non-residential buildings with a view to increasing the number of premises records which are available to the Brigade's operational staff on the operational risk database. Develop guidance to assist staff to create consistent tactical plans focused on improving speed of firefighting and life-saving interventions. Develop a new policy guidance to address known outstanding risks through the Brigade's home fire safety visits and other engagement activities. Establish a corporate mechanism by which targets for the Brigade's Section 72D activities are set. Now that, as we understand it, formed the basis for the actions that are referred to as Actions 2A, 2B, 2C and 2D in the Lachnal Assurance Review, a document to which you've clearly had regard in reaching your statement. Is that correct?
That's true, yes.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to take a moment to identify each of the actions as described in the Lachnal Assurance Review. And if I could ask the trial director to bring up the...
Before we do that, Mr. Kinnear, can you just help me with this? Because I want to understand where we're going. The recommendation doesn't address concerns about this system for obtaining information. It's concerned with sharing information gained as a result of Section 72D and so on visits. Is there anything in this that actually deals with sharing of information?
When you say this, you mean the response or the...
Response, yes.
Not especially, no. Well,
so this
no.
doesn't actually address the recommendation at all?
No.
All right, thank you.
That's a point which will be covered with Mr. Dobson.
Right, thank you very much.
If we could go to the assurance review itself, which is LFB 0004801. And if we could put page 4 of the Commissioner's letter, so LFB 0042089 side by side, thank you. Now, in the Coroner's recommendation 2 is set out on page 25 of the assurance review. So if we could look at page 25, thank you. And it's in the left column, bold blue text. And action 2A is then identified on the same page in the right-hand column. Thank you. As we see, 2A is there identified. Do you have it, Mr. Brown?
Yes.
And it's it says review existing policy related to information gathering contingency plans. Excuse me. That corresponds to the first bullet point in the Commissioner's letter to the Coroner. Would you agree?
Yes.
Now, if we can, apologies to the Trial Director for this, but if we can go to page 27 in the Assurance Review, looking at the left-hand column, and the bold red text identifies action 2B, which is to create an inspection regime targeted at high-priority buildings. Would you agree that 2B corresponds to the second bullet point in the Commissioner's response letter?
Yes.
Action 2C is also on page 27 of the Assurance Review, and you'll see that is entitled Develop New Policy Guidance to Address Known Outstanding Risks Identified Through Home Fire Safety Visits. That corresponds to the fourth bullet point in the Commissioner's response.
Yes.
Thank you. And finally, Action 2D, D for Delta, is also on page 27, and that is entitled Set Corporate Targets for 7.2D Activities. Would you agree that that corresponds to the fifth bullet point in the Commissioner's response letter?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, just to add administrative complexity, Action 2 and its four component parts were also known as Action 18, A to D, in the context of the LFB's internal Lachnal House Action Plan. Do you remember that level of detail?
Yes, and it wasn't particularly helpful. That was an action plan being incorporated with another action plan and being renumbered, but yes.
Yeah, and if we could just so people know what we're talking about, if we can put, with apologies again to the Trial Director, if we can put both of those documents down and put another one up, which is LFB 0002937. Now, this is the LFB's Rule 43 monitoring report. We can see its date in the top right corner, November 2013. And for people who are watching proceedings, these documents were produced regularly following the Lachnal House inquests for the purpose of monitoring the LFB's progress in implementing the actions identified to satisfy the Coroner's recommendations. Is that a fair and accurate summary, Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Now, we can see from the top of the first page that this was a consolidated action plan arising from actions arising at Lachnal, as well as those arising from another inquest, which was Shirley Towers in Hampshire. Is that right?
Yes, Shirley Towers happened not long after Lachnal, and we was minded to look at the issues out of that and see whether there's any that applied to our own organisation, so we combine them together.
Thank you. If we can turn to page 17. And here we find the entries for Action 18 Parts A to B. And if we could look very briefly at the text in the third column, i.e. the middle one, I think, under the heading LFB Action. A, review existing policy related to information gathering. B, create an inspection regime targeting high-priority buildings. C, develop new policy to address outstanding risks from home fire safety visits. And if we turn over the page. D, set corporate targets for 7.2D activities. Just to bring everything full circle, these are what you and the Lachnal Assurance Review refer to as Action 2, Parts A to D. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, we can also see here in the far right, in the fourth column, under the heading Lead, that you were allocated as the sole lead officer for each component part of Action 18. Is that right? Apart from Action 18A.
Yes, where I was a joint lead, yes.
And you were joint lead with AC Fire Safety and Regulation, who was Steve Chirek at the time.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, apologies for that somewhat pedantic, painful trawl through the bureaucracy. Can we go back to page 4 of the Commissioner's letter to the Coroner, which is at LFB 000, thank you, 42089/4. Now, can you help us? How was the coroner's recommendation that the Brigade, quotes, review procedures for sharing information gained as a result of Section 72D visits converted into the 5 actions proposed by the Commissioner in this letter?
So, as a senior management group, we discussed each of the recommendations from the coroner, and discussed ways that we could achieve them. So we broke them down into component parts that we felt added to the completion of each of the recommendations. And these were the issues that we agreed as a group that would address the coroner's recommendation.
What was the extent of your involvement as joint lead in respect of A and sole lead in respect of the other 3 actions that were required?
Well, the joint lead on A was because we used premises information plates. We incorporated that into this particular action 2A. And the premises information plates were plates that were allocated to high-rise residential buildings, and on that regard, we needed input from regulatory fire safety, which is where the joint lead come in with regulatory fire safety.
It was probably because my question was unclear. What was the extent of your involvement? What did you do? What were you doing?
Oh, I see.
To lead the work or jointly lead the work to implement these recommendations?
So it varies. So overall, what I would have done is allocated members of staff to deal with each of these, and then they would have reported back to me. I had more to do with some than others, but overall, yes, I would be allocating members of staff to complete each of these leads and then report back by a dedicated time.
Did anyone during the course of this work ask the question that the chairman asked? Which was, the recommendation is focused on sharing. What are these recommendations doing to meet the concerns the coroner obviously had in respect of sharing of information?
No, they didn't.
Can you help us as to why?
I think that the 2A, the first one, undertake a review of the existing policy. So by using that policy and by collecting the information and rolling out mobile data terminals. So operational staff were collecting the information, feeding it into the operational risk database, the appropriate information, and that information would then be regurgitated to operational crews, i.e. shared, as and when they arrived at incidents.
So although it's not articulated anywhere,
yes,
the assumption was that the MDT was the mechanism by which improvements would be made to the sharing of information. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, and I think to varying degrees, each of the 5 make sure that we've got the appropriate information to be shared, and enhances that sharing. So I totally understand the Chair's question in that regard. Looking at it now, I can see that it isn't clear, but we were satisfied that it was dealing with sharing the information within the organisation to the appropriate people at the right time.
Now, looking at the extent to which the actions implemented the response to the recommendation, the 3rd bullet point set out in the Commissioner's response, develop guidance to assist staff to create consistent technical plans focused on improving speed of firefighting and life-saving interventions. That isn't covered in any of the 4 actions that purported to implement these actions. Do you accept that?
I feel that 3rd bullet point is effectively a subset of the 1st bullet point, but in terms of individually highlighting it and reporting against it, yes, I would accept that that's missing.
Why does Action 2A or 18A not specifically address the 3rd bullet point?
I suggest it's because of an over-familiarisation with what Policy Note 800 was all about. So obviously it was about hazard information and it was about tactical plans, of which is that third bullet point. So I think it was just an unhelpful assumption on our part that the third bullet point is part of the first bullet point. But in terms of reporting, then clearly that's not clear.
Now, let's look at Action 2A, 18A, which is the review of existing policy related to information gathering and contingency plans. Now, we know it deals with those matters. Can we now turn to your first witness statement, which is at LFB 000-32166/22 and paragraph 71. Here you say this. This action was shared with the AC Fire Safety Regulation, Steve Turek. My involvement in this action was limited to providing operational insight into the feasibility and practicalities of obtaining useful information. I was also involved in the initiative to introduce EPIPs. Now, in his statement, and probably useful to go to it so you can see it, it can be found at LFB 000-32128/11. In his statement at paragraph 34, AC Turek said this, Action 2A. The third officer, so that's you, had primary responsibility for the execution of this action. Again, I provided support of a technical nature, namely to advise on our responsibilities under fire safety legislation. Now, you can't both be right. Having gone through the relevant documents, having seen Mr. Turek's recollection, are you wrong or is he wrong?
Can you just remind me, please, of exactly what I said in...
Yes, we can go back to your witness statement, which is at LFB 000-32166/22, so it's there on the page, and paragraph 71.
I don't think either of us are wrong. I think it's just in the terminology we've used. I think my phrase "limited" to providing, I guess, suggests it was a minor role. I didn't mean it in that regard. If we was to do a percentage split between the two of us, I guess I would have had a greater percentage responsibility.
And so Mr. Turek was right in the sense that you had primary responsibility.
Well, primary suggests one is more important than the other. I don't think that, but I would accept that I took a larger share of responsibility, yes.
In fairness to him, he said primary responsibility for the execution of this action.
Yes, because it very much would have been my staff that were involved in collecting information. It would have been the technical know-how of Steve Turek that would have been key to this.
Now we've got that cleared up, can we look at a later version of the Lachnal and Shirley Towers Rule 43 action plan? And that can be found at LFB 000-31066. And this is dated March 2016. There we see the date in the top right corner. And if we could turn to page 22, which deals with Action 18A, also known as Action 2A. And we can see 18 is at the bottom, and just reading across from the left to the right. The first entry in the Action Update column at the far right-hand side says this, 4th of July 2013, a review of PN 800 has been completed and it has been recommended to include 7.2D guidance in PN 800 rather than create a new and separate policy. Who carried out the review of Policy 800?
That would have been my department. I think it was a group manager, Andrew Bell, I think, who would have led on it.
Is he now AC, Andy Bell?
Yes.
What is the Section 7.2D guidance referred to here?
There was discussion over, but because of the prominence of 7.2D, there was discussion over whether there should be a separate standalone policy on 7.2D. but on the basis that we were also organisationally keen to keep things as straightforward as possible and not increase the number of policies, rather amalgamate, we decided that Policy Note 800 was an appropriate place to use 72D guidance, so we would incorporate it there.
Why there, rather than, say, for example, Appendix 1 of 633 as well?
That's a good question. I think the reason is because Policy Note 633 is all about high-rise firefighting. So whilst there's clearly essential that we've got the appropriate information in terms of on-arrival tactics, Policy Note 800 is a better fit because this is all about information gathering before the incident. So we felt that's where it better sat.
Thank you. So it's just after 3:15. This is a convenient place.
Well, then we better have a break now, hadn't we?
Thanks, sir.
Yes. Well, Mr. Brown, I think this is a good time for us to have the afternoon break. We'll stop now. We'll resume at 3:30, please. And as usual, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher, please? Thank you, Mr. Kinnear. 3:30 then.
Thanks, sir.
Okay. Would you ask Mr. Brown to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Brown?
Yes, thank
ready
you.
to carry on? Good. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Can we go back to the March 2016 action plan,
Yes.
which can be found at LFB 000310666/22. Now, that's the page that we were discussing just before the afternoon break. If I could ask us to turn over the page to page 23, and looking at that far right column, Mr. Brown, what we see there in broad terms is a iterative process of amendment and consultations relating to PN 800. And if we turn over the page to 24, that process ended on the 27th of August, 25th of August 2015, when the process ended. Now, can you help us as to why it took over 2 years for the iterative process of amendment and consultation to take place and before the policy was finally published on the 25th of August 2015?
Can we go back, please?
Where would you like to go back to, page 22 or 23?
Oh, sorry, just so I can quickly remind myself of some of the iterations in this action update.
If we go to 23, that's probably the easiest.
Thank you. Okay, well, two things. I'm slightly surprised to see that, because I thought there'd been an issuing of the policy in 2013, which is why I just wanted to read that. But clearly that doesn't support what I thought was the case. So in terms of the second issue as to why it took so long, this was a key policy, and we had a long and arduous path to go through in terms of consultation. There was two staff side arenas: industrial relations and health and safety. And it was a process that we needed to go all the way through one process, industrial relations, and then start all over again at health and safety. We tried in the past with staff side to have a one-stop shop where we had one set of discussions and consultations, but we weren't successful. Unfortunately, this was in the backdrop of difficult industrial relations with staff side, and things tended to take a long time. So not wishing to apportion blame, but clearly this got caught up in long discussions with staff side, both from industrial relations perspective and a health and safety perspective.
Can you just tell us, Mr. Brown, what is BJCHSW?
That's a Brigade Joint Committee for Health and Safety.
Because it seems to have got stuck there between June or July and November, and maybe a bit even beyond.
Yes, it was health and safety of the two would be the more difficult in terms of satisfying staff side, and there was also a difference in opinion whether these documents were what we call consultative, i.e. we ask staff side's opinion and we do our best to achieve it, but we can do it anyway, or negotiation where we cannot move forward without their agreement. And because issues were so difficult, we would invariably opt for the negotiation type, because what we didn't want to do was cause any more challenges with staff side than already existed. So what that meant was sometimes things were being requested by staff side which were difficult to achieve, and we spent time trying to weed our way through it. I was involved in industrial relations consultations. It would have been a different set of people. I think Danny Cotton at some point in BJC, HS&W, the health and safety side of it.
Just taking the step back from this, as the chairman observed, about 9 months out of this process seems to be consumed by discussions with the BJCHSW out of a period roughly of 2 years. Is that the norm, that the process where a policy change bites on or touches health and safety, that the process of amendment consultation would take something in the order of 2 years?
No.
9 months? No. Was that exceptional, that it would take this long?
Yes.
Can you remember now what the particular concerns were that had been raised in the forum of the BJCHSW that consumed so much time?
No, I can't, I'm afraid. I would have had nothing whatsoever to do with the health and safety consultations. Mine would have been purely the industrial relation consultations.
Even in terms of office discussions, can you remember whether the concerns raised, staff side, concerned the subject matter, the substance of the policy, or was it sort of other issues that caused the delay?
I'm sorry, I'd be speculating if I was to try to guess. I'm sorry.
Do you recall if, as part of the review and consultation process, there was any discussion of any of the concerns in relation to 72D visits that we've been discussing today? For example, inconsistent approach of crews to identifying buildings in need of visits?
That certainly was an issue that was discussed, and staff side, to their credit, always would have been seeking appropriate training for their members, i.e. our firefighters, in terms of achieving a new policy.
Do you remember whether there was much substantive discussion, if any, about concerns about the quality of entries on the ORD and their inconsistency?
That was an issue that we raised, management side, in terms of why we wanted such a policy and a risk assessment process. But to my memory, staff side hadn't raised that issue. That was one of our issues.
Looked at more generally, did anyone raise that particular concern?
Outside the management team?
Yeah.
Not that I can recall, no.
Can you remember whether there was much discussion, whether in the management team or staff side, of the question whether operational crews properly understood what was required of them when carrying out Section 72D visits?
There wasn't, when we was consulting on this policy from the management side, we were satisfied that the training would address that issue. I don't recall staff side raising any issues in that regard.
Okay. Mr. Brown, can we now turn on to Action 2B, or 18B, which was creation of an inspection regime targeted at high priority buildings. Can we start, first of all, with what your understanding was of what this action required? First of all, what did you understand high priority buildings to encompass?
Yeah, high priority buildings was a phrase that got into discussions. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but we could translate it across really to high risk buildings.
Did this phrase emerge, did people understand what it meant? Was everyone talking to the same definition?
I don't think it was a phrase that was corporately used, but certainly in the exchanges on this particular action, it found its way into the correspondence between us, and I think it caused, at least for a period of time, some unnecessary confusion.
But eventually, did those involved in the review understand that it was a synonym for high-risk buildings?
Yes.
Who brought clarity to the confusion? Did you knock heads together, or?
No, I think it just. I think in correspondence it just became clear what was meant, and the higher priority phrase just disappeared.
How did you understand that the proposed inspection regime would relate to the existing regime for carrying out 72D visits under Policy 800?
Well, so the existing regime was about staff finding buildings that currently had never been assessed, and B, once they had been assessed, following the risk matrix in terms of frequency. So it was the bit about getting buildings, if I can call, let's call them unknown buildings. So if getting unknown buildings onto the operational risk database. So the inspection regime was about giving some guidance as to where to focus your efforts to get those unknown buildings onto the operational risk database. Because without that guidance, there was the danger that that buildings of a lower risk, shall we say, might be being visited, and of a higher risk are just sitting there waiting to be visited. So it's to try and give some structure around that inertia of getting more premises onto the ORD.
I suppose the one thing that's telling about that answer is that it begs the question, how do you define high risk? And to what extent did the discussion seek to identify that concept first as a means of providing context for the new proposed regime?
So this was a 2B or 18B was a task that I asked Tom George, who was a Deputy Assistant Commissioner, to undertake for me. And Tom then sought the assistance of one of his borough commanders within his area, John Elwell, who also happened to be the lead for the service standard that dealt with this kind of thing. So that was a wise choice. And it was between the three of us. I think there was some initial clarification required, but we resolved that.
So when, thinking back, we can go to it if you want, but when Mr Dobson responded to the coroner that the creation of this new inspection regime was specifically, quote, with a view to increasing the number of premises records which were available to the Brigade's operational staff on the ORD, that appears to have been your understanding also about the aim of the exercise.
Yeah, it was to get more on there, but also make sure it was the right ones in the right order.
And it was not confined to high-rise buildings, it was buildings generally from
Yes.
what I'd make from your evidence.
Yes, yeah, there was a banding process, and high-rise was one of the priority bands.
Now, just flowing on from the evidence you gave in respect of Tom George, can we go to his statement, which can be found at LFB 000 32823/17 and paragraph 69. Thank you. And we see there at paragraph 69, Mr George said this: in November 2013, the third officer instructed me to carry out some work on a particular action from the Lachnal House Action Plan, namely to create an inspection regime targeted at high priority buildings. One of my borough commanders, Borough Commander for Kingston, was already the lead officer for Service Standard 7, Operational Contingency Planning. With the third officer's agreement, I therefore asked the Borough Commander for Kingston to consider the action and put forward a proposal on what could be achieved. Now, just to get some understanding of the hierarchy, Tom George at this stage was a Deputy Assistant Commissioner who reported to you, is that right?
That's correct.
The Borough Commander from Kingston, that's John Elwell, is that right?
That's correct.
Can you help us? Mr Elwell's role as the lead officer for Service Standard 7, what did that role entail?
So service standards was something that was in the brigade some considerable time ago, and for whatever reason it fell by the wayside, and it was something that I always thought was a shame, and it should be reintroduced because it helps standardise issues across the brigade. So I sought to reintroduce those after I managed to consolidate the north and the south of London together. I then set up, I think there was 10 service standards, and then we sought to provide a lead for each one of those service standards in terms of creating those service standards all over again, coming up with common standards that every borough across the brigade could use, performance indicators that cross-reference with them, and advice and guidance really. So a new borough commander could look at these, and he or she could be following the same process as a very experienced borough commander. So I had the same thing going on. And this one, Service Standard 7, Operational Contingency Planning, covered amongst other things 7.2Ds. So John Elwell's role was to arrange the standards and the performance indicators, etc., to bring that up to fruition that the whole brigade could use.
I think there are now 11 service standards.
okay.
I don't know whether there were in your time. But would it be fair to say that the weight of those standards is concerned with measuring performance in a manner akin to KPIs?
That's part of the role, but it's also to give guidance on what should be done and how it should be done, which together leads into a performance indicator.
Can you help us as to what about the particular role of lead officer for Service Standard 7, Operational Contingency Planning, made Mr. Elwell appropriate for leading the work on Action 2B?
Well, because the whole issue of 7.2Ds is about information gathering, so effectively creating contingency plans for operations, i.e. incidents. So it fell squarely within Service Standard 7, the whole issue of information gathering 7.2Ds.
Can we now turn to an email chain which can be found at Lfb 000 42252? Now, this is an email chain from November 2013 between DAC Tom George and John Elwell. If we can go to the bottom of page 2, which is an email from Tom George to John Elwell, and it says this: John, as you're the Service Standards Lead Officer for Operational Contingency Planning, Dave Brown has given out a piece of work that I'd like you to think about and put some suggestions to me, please. The Coroner's Rule 43 letter, monitoring report, following Shirley Towers and Lachnal House, includes an Action 18. The Brigade reviews procedures for sharing information gained as a result of Section 72D visits, with crews both within the station in question and other local stations. As a result of this, PN 800 is being reviewed, Action 18A. As you know, also attached to this action is to create an inspection regime targeted at high priority buildings, Action 18B, and it is this that Dave and I would like you to review, please. There are currently only 7,000 ORD entries, and the third officer feels there should be more. He wants us to beef up our inspection programme. Can you please have a think on this and put a proposal to me on what would be more appropriate than what is done currently and how this could be achieved? Dave has asked for a response ASAP, so could I ask for your thoughts within 2 weeks if possible? Many thanks, much appreciated. Now, Tom George has taken your name in vain there, or he's certainly taken your name. Is he doing justice to your intentions when he says that you wanted to, quotes, beef up, close quotes, the inspection programme?
I don't recall making that comment, but...
Does it convey the tenor of your aspirations for the work?
I would have said, I may well have said that, but it was far more than just beef up the inspection programme. I had regular meetings with the Deputy Assistant Commissioners and probably spoke with them almost daily as well, by telephone or otherwise. Certainly had numerous email conversations with them. And so I've made it clear to Tom that I want an inspection programme that A, leads to more ORD entries, and B, gets the right ones on there. If that is interpreted as beef up, I think that oversimplifies it, but it's not an unreasonable way to describe part of it.
It seems on the basis of that he's fairly summarised your intentions in terms of getting more premises details on the ORD.
Yes, but also making sure that we get the right ones on there as well, at least to start off with.
Can you help us? The reference to 7,000 properties in that quote, was that a reference to high-rise properties specifically or just properties generally?
No, that was the total number of buildings that are on the operational risk database. So the operational risk database is really could be any non-commercial building, or indeed, as in high-rise, for example, it could be residential buildings. So there's a whole range of different buildings that could effectively be on the ORD.
Tom George sent this email. Can we now look at John Elwell's response, which starts at the bottom of page 1 of the chain? He asks, first of all, for a copy of the monitoring report, and then goes on to ask this in the bottom of the page. Could you also confirm the use definition of the term high priority buildings in Action 18B as, turning over the page, currently this does not accord with any terminology in PN 800. Based on the premises risk assessments, Appendix 2, premises are rated as high risk. Is this the same concept, or does the action plan refer or allude to a different grading model? Now, Mr. George replied at the top of page 1 in the second paragraph. And he answers candidly, I have no other detail other than this. Have a look, and if I still need to seek guidance on high priority buildings, I will do, but I'd read this as those that present the greatest risk to firefighters. Now, did Mr. George discuss the definition of high priority buildings with you as part of the iterative process of clarification that you referred to earlier on?
Certainly Tom did come back to me. I can't recall the conversations, but what I do know is that we eventually got to the agreed position that we're talking about high risk as defined by the action plan.
Here, high risk is more specific. It's that which presents the greatest risk to firefighters. Was that your understanding of what the term meant at the time?
I wouldn't describe it in that way necessarily. We were obviously always massively concerned about the risk to our staff in emergency incidents, and one could argue that those sites that are the highest risk to the public also are of great risk to firefighters. But I wouldn't simplify it in those terms.
So, did Mr. George say to you, Gov, have I got the right definition?
I can't recall exact details of our conversation, but I do know we got to the position in the end where it was about high risk as per the action plan.
I.e., greatest risk to both firefighters and residents of those buildings?
Absolutely.
Can we now turn to a briefing paper, which is the initial paper that Mr. Elwell produced, which can be found at Lfb 000 32825. On page 1 of the paper, which is entitled Action 18B, London Fire Brigade Consolidated Action Plan, following Coroner's recommendations, the third paragraph under the heading Background sets out a number of issues which Mr. Elwell identified as, quotes, implicit within the concern on numbers of ORD entries. And if we could just go through these simply because of the importance of the document. A, is the existing guidance, PN 800, fit for purpose to achieve the desired outcomes? B, what other brigade data could be deployed to identify relevant premises for inclusion on the ORD? C, are the 7,000 we have all relevant and in compliance with the guidance in PN 800? D, which premises are missing from the ORD given the guidance in PN 800? E, what is the capacity of a station watch in terms of the number of ORD entries that can be effectively entered and revisited with the existing guidance? A pertinent point given the disparity of the numbers, risk and types of premises on different stations ground. F, is the quality of existing ORD entries providing data to underpin safe systems of work? G, are our staff competent to carry out the 72D visits and enter meaningful data and professional tactical plans? H, what are the existing performance evaluation tools to monitor performance? I, what service standard is in place to quality assure the relevant extant policies? As these issues start to be effectively defined, addressed and monitored, I would suggest that an improvement in the quality and quantity of ORD entries will be observed. Note, the term high priority buildings used in Action 18B does not accord with the definitions in the Extant Policy Note 800 or Draft Policy Note 800. This term is therefore taken to mean high risk in line with the terminology currently in use in both versions of PN 800. Now, taking the step back, that's a summary rich in detail and complexity. Mr. Elwell was proposing a fundamental review of the basic adequacy of the Brigade's existing operational risk management systems. Would you agree with that description?
Yes.
Can we now look at another email chain, which can be found at LFB 000 I'm afraid this is a long chain, and could we go to page 10 on the bottom of that page? We can see there that on the 13th of December 2013, Mr. Elwell lodged his report both with you and Tom George. Do you recall receiving Mr. Elwell's report?
Yes.
Now, Mr. George followed up with the following email to you the next day, and that can be found at the bottom of page 9. Mr. Elwell is not copied in to this email. And again, apologies for reading it out. Dave, following the action given to me at PMB regarding Action 18 from the Rule 43 letter following the Shirley Towers and Lachnal House incidents, specifically to create an inspection regime targeted at high-priority buildings, I asked John Elwell, lead officer for SS7, to look into this and provide me with some suggestions which I was going to review, collate with other observations, and report back to you at or before the next PMB. John has been extremely thorough and produced a 16-page report, attached and already forwarded to you from John. This report is actually only 5 pages long and is well worth a read. The following pages are associated appendices. John has made some recommendations which I've listed below, although they really need to be read in context. You asked me to think about how we can improve on our 7.2D inspection programme, particularly for high-risk premises. I believe John's report does exactly that, and each recommendation should therefore be carefully considered in my opinion. Please let me know how you wish for this to be taken forward, or I'll leave it to you to raise at PMB. Unfortunately, I'm not there on Wednesday as I'm on leave. Mr. George then listed the recommendations from the report in the latter half of his email. Recommendation 1, that the ongoing review of PN 800 provides explicit detail of the types of risk that should be present. The layout of the notes should be user-friendly and be a one-stop shop for all guidance pertaining to the ORD system, including the gap analysis undertaken during the service standard process. Recommendation 2, if an immediate focus is required on the completion of the ORD to enhance the quantity of entries, then face-to-face meetings should take place between the appropriate managers, that's Deputy Assistant Commissioner and Borough Commander and Station Manager and Watch Manager, to reinforce the provisions of PN 800 and the expectations required. This can be undertaken as part of the performance management review cycle, or if required in a more urgent manner as a bespoke meeting specifically for this purpose. Recommendation 3. When the revised PN 800 is promulgated, the publication is carried out simultaneously with a series of face-to-face workshops with station and borough commanders. These workshops should provide a detailed explanation and expectation of the content of PN 800. The current practice of entering new policy notes onto the station circulation folder or announcing the policy by email will not be sufficient to effectively explain the expectations required. With apologies, it continues, turning over the page. Recommendation 4, a feasibility study is undertaken into the use of existing Brigade data. Recommendation 5, a review is undertaken of the disparity of risks across different station grounds, and a methodology developed to determine the optimum number of ORD entries for stations with high numbers of applicable premises. Recommendation 6, further training is provided to all personnel with a role in the ORD process to ensure they have the skills to meet the competencies required. Recommendation 7, consideration is given to redefining the KPIs in Service Standard 7 to include measurement of the quantity and quality of ORD entries. Recommendation 8, the Service Standard Board finalises the arrangements in a timely manner for the publication of agreed service standards, associated systems and policies. With particular reference to Service Standard 7, the timely publication will provide a further performance assurance process to improve ORD entries, both in quantity and quality. Now, it's a very long run-up to one final email before I actually ask a question. If we go to the top of page 9, and you responded on the 16th of December 2013, so just 2 days later. Tom, this is interesting and helpful, and I'm sure we can use some of John's recommendations. However, it doesn't feel to me that any of the recommendations actually deals with the requirement to, quotes, create an inspection regime targeted at high priority buildings. Or am I missing something? Now, that's a very long run-up to one short question. Was your view that Mr. Elwell's report did not fulfil the brief of creating an inspection regime targeting high priority buildings?
That's correct, yes.
Do you accept that Mr. Elwell's report raised some significant broader concerns, though, about the adequacy of the LFB's current arrangements?
Yes, however, I do need to qualify that because some of the recommendations that he raised had been dealt with already, were being dealt with, within John's sphere of influence to deal with by virtue of the fact that he was contributing to the policy note 800 and he was also lead service standard 7, and there were one or two that were very aspirational, and in an ideal world, yes, great, but the reality just didn't work.
Well, let's look at some of the black and white of some of these recommendations, and could we go to LFB 000-32825/2? Now, looking at recommendations 2 and 3, which are in the top half of this page, both those recommendations emphasise the importance of face-to-face meetings and workshop between crews and their managers. Do you accept that?
Recommendation 2 and 3 ask for that kind of interaction, yes.
Yes. And recommendation 2, I don't think there's any serious doubt, but you accept and you agree and endorse the aim to enhance the quantity of some of the quality and quantity of the entries on the ORD. Is that fair?
Yes.
And would you agree that in order to achieve the improvements in both quality and quantity, what was required was more face-to-face time between operational staff and their managers to explain what was required of them for the purpose of the process? Do you accept that?
I accept it, but then I also expect that was normal business.
Given it was the subject of recommendation, isn't that a warning, or at least a suggestion to you that it wasn't routinely part of normal business across the LFB's operations?
No, because I know that it was the case. I mean, so John, for example, was a borough commander. So and I knew John, for example, had regular meetings with the DAC, and I knew John had regular meetings with his station manager. So this, to me, seemed to be stating it's the correct thing to do, but it was already happening. This is normal business.
But I suppose, isn't that the problem? Haven't you inadvertently put your finger on the problem, though? You've got a borough commander who is the lead on Service Standard 7. He's making a recommendation to you that there should be more or face-to-face meetings. That 10 suggested isn't happening because he's felt the need to make the recommendation. Why isn't that a reasonable supposition based on what he's setting out here?
I can only use so my knowledge of the brigade, by this time, this is 2013, so I had been in post now for 7 years nearly, and my experience in them 7 years is that actually there was an abundance of meetings, and I could use my knowledge in terms of I was aware of what was going on all over London in every single borough, and I knew that DACs met with their borough commanders and borough commanders met with their station managers. I knew that for a fact.
Sorry to interrupt. Let's look at the level below. You've keenly emphasised those discussions. What about the most pertinent discussions between crews and their managers?
Well, again, from my experience, this is something that was happening. I mean, what I would want to emphasise is recommendation 2 is a sound recommendation. It's absolutely right. There should be discussion between crews and managers and watch managers and station managers, etc., is absolutely right, but it's something that is already happening. So my understanding of why that recommendation is being put in there is because it's the right thing to do. It shouldn't necessarily be drawn to the conclusion it's not happening. There's other recommendations in here as well that are the right thing to do, but also were already happening.
Can we look at recommendation 3 in relation to things that are already happening, and look at the last 3 lines, which says the current practice of entering new policy notes onto the station circulation folder or announcing the policy by email will not be sufficient to effectively explain the expectations required. Now, were those means of communication consistent with your experience? Were new policies usually introduced simply by insertion in a folder or circulation by email without accompanying workshops or training?
That was the case sometimes, yes.
Sometimes. That formula of words there suggests it was generally the case.
It depends on what the policy was and what the prior knowledge. So the issue that we would always consider, and we did this in training packages as well, is what is the gap, what is the need in terms of what staff need to know, and then we would think to ourselves, how do we address that need? Do we address that need through a training package, or through face-to-face meetings, or by an email announcement, or just by a policy being sent out for staff to read through? There was a desire for staff to always have some kind of training package or extended explanation, but that isn't always practical or necessary.
Now, can we go back and look at recommendation 5, which can be found at page 3 and the second paragraph on that page? Now, the report recommended there at 5, a review is undertaken of the disparity of risk across different station grounds and a methodology developed to determine the optimum number of ORD entries for stations with high numbers of applicable premises. Now, that's an issue you refer to in paragraph 40 of your second statement. It'd probably be useful if we go to it. LFB 000-84020/15. And if we look at paragraph 40 at the bottom of the page, you say there are 33 boroughs across London. There is significant variation between the built environment in each London borough. Some boroughs will have a large amount of commercial buildings, whereas others will have a high percentage of residential buildings, and some will have both, all of which require an awareness of by fire station staff. Accordingly, it was impractical to set fixed targets for the number of Section 72D visits that staff at each fire station should complete in high-rise residential buildings, as it would place an inequitable workload on some fire station staff that was not placed on others, especially when taking into account a range of other commitments such as training and community safety. Again, apologies for the long run-up to a short question. Did a review of disparity of risks that was recommended by Mr. Elwell take place?
A review, no, but a recognition that was an accurate summary of an issue to be resolved, and I put in place a method to resolve it.
Why was the review not carried out?
Because I think we were both in agreement that there was a disparity, so the review would only have confirmed what we already knew and agreed about.
And so the recognition was on your part that you referred to?
Oh yes, absolutely. It was something that I was fully aware of anyway, and John quite rightly also underlined the point.
And what method did you put in place to resolve it?
So there's a lot been mentioned about crews on their own station's ground, and there is where the inequity lies. So we had a method called strategic resource, and what that effectively did was it allowed us to take a fire engine off the run, i.e. make it unavailable for a shift. And in that time, the crew on that fire engine could go anywhere they liked in London to do training or community safety activities. And so strategic resource had been developed so that we could take a large number of fire engines off the run on particular shifts. So then what I did was knowing which boroughs had a higher prevalence of high-rise buildings and other buildings that needed to go on the operational risk database, we put systems in place where we would flood, for want of a better expression, certain areas with a number of appliances, number of fire engines, and say to them, you need to go out and, in line with what the station manager of that station has given you, go and inspect these buildings and get them on the operational risk database. So that would assist. So, for example, the city has got one fire engine in it, the City of London, but yet has got, as one would imagine, an incredible amount of high-rise. They could never do it on their own. So we'd send other appliances in. And I would always use the analogy, because it wasn't popular, people didn't like the idea of this, and I would use the analogy that if there was a large fire in the city, you'd have no problem coming from Havering in the east to help out with that fire in the middle. So equally, you should have no problem coming in the middle and helping out with doing some inspections that needed to go on beforehand. And I use that same philosophy with home fire safety visits and things where it required a large number of personnel in an area where we wouldn't normally have a large number of personnel. So that was my approach to dealing with John's recommendation, although to be fair, that was something that was in my mind to do anyway. John just quite rightly underlined the need for it.
The recommendation, number 5, is in 2 parts. The first part is a review of the disparity of risks. The second part is development of a methodology to determine the optimum number of ORD entries for stations. Now, as I understand the evidence you've just given, the method you put in place did not involve developing a methodology to determine the optimum number of ORD entries. Is that right?
In terms of, if what you mean by that is how many exist on that station's ground, so when we know it's complete, no, it didn't, because we were still struggling at that time to determine how many there actually were.
Was a methodology ever developed?
No.
No. Why not?
Because we just didn't know how many there were there. So the idea was that we would just, we knew what areas they would be in terms of, if you look at London as 3 rings, is the inner ring, and then the second ring is where most of them will be. The inner ring mostly commercial, the second ring mostly residential, the outer ring, the more suburbs, far less of either. So we knew where to place our resources, but we just didn't know at that time, and whether the brigade knows now, I'm not sure, but we didn't know at that time exactly when that pot will be exhausted. But we also felt that we were so far away from exhausting the pot that there was little point in putting too much effort into it, because we weren't near the finishing line on that one. We just needed to. It was a front to our common sense. We knew there was so many missing, and we needed to get them on there.
Thank you. Could we go back to Mr. Elwell's report and look at recommendation 6, which we found at LFB 000328254/3. That's the bottom of page 3, where he said this, or recommended this: further training is provided to all personnel with a role in the ORD process to ensure they have the skills to meet the competencies required. The paragraph at the bottom of page 3, immediately above this recommendation, says this: during the development of the service standard, presumably 7, and at recent instance, a number of existing ORD entries have been examined. A number of substandard examples were found. This could indicate a poor understanding of the rationale and a lack of competency based on the above list in recording relevant risk and tactical planning information at all levels of the process: watch manager, station manager, borough commander, Deputy Assistant Commissioner. Was that reference to substandard ORD entries any cause of concern for you, first of all?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, of course.
Yeah. And were you already aware of the problem of substandard entries?
Yes, which is, I don't overplay in terms of substandard entries, but in my view, one substandard entry is one too many. We can have no flexibility on this. So yes, I was aware that there were examples, but then that was part of the reason why we were doing what we were doing with Policy Note 800, and also with the training that had probably only just been rolled out some 7 months before John made this recommendation.
You don't want to overplay the problem about substandard entries in respect to the ORD. We already know the substandard nature of the entry in relation to Grenfell.
Yes.
That's the subject of findings. Could we look at another one, which is, rather, can we look at the ORD entry for Grenfell, which is LFB quadruple 03116? And it's something we've touched on earlier, but it's probably useful to go back onto to remind people. The ORD entry was considered in phase 1, and a number of deficiencies were identified. I'll take you through them. First of all, there were no plans of the tower on the ORD, despite the fact that Nicholas Davis, the station manager, noted that plans are required. And we see that on the entry for the 10th of May, which is in the 5th row in the main table on page 1. Secondly, the only photograph of the tower was a small aerial image which gave no information about the building or access to that building, and that can be seen at page 7. Thirdly, the incorrect number of floors was recorded. 20 is stated on page 3 under hazards. And under the heading Tactical Plan on page 4, the subheading Operational Contingency Plan contains simply a blank box dated the 30th of October 2009. Are you familiar with the ORD entry for Grenfell Tower?
No. I've become aware of it clearly since the inquiry, but prior to that, no.
Were you aware of the extent of the findings in relation to the deficiencies of that ORD that was made by the chairman in the phase 1 report?
Yes.
Was the standard of ORD entry, as exemplified by Grenfell, typical of the quality of ORD entries generally, in your experience?
No.
Did you agree with Mr. Elwell that the problem of substandard entries could indicate a poor understanding of the rationale and a lack of competency on the part of personnel who made those entries?
Not a poor understanding. I think staff did understand. But I think what it does indicate is that there's somewhere along the line there's clearly a gap in the process, and this entry on Grenfell is clearly poor and wrong. And when I found out about this, yes, it was something that I reflected on and thought, how could this happen?
Did you reflect upon it to the extent of actually taking action, for example, requiring further training to remedy the potential problems identified by Mr. Elwell, poor understanding of the rationale and a lack of competency?
Well, when I saw this entry, obviously I'd left the brigade, but at the time, in terms of John's recommendation back in 2013, more training, yeah, it was a valid point, but my position on that was we had only just rolled out the training some 6 or 7 months prior to that, so the need for further training, I took the position that what we needed to do is what we do with all training, we roll it out and then we monitor performance in terms of entries into the operational management performance database. And if we find evidence that it's not working, and also in fatal fire reviews and in training exercises and in performance reviews of commands, if there's evidence coming through that despite that training it's still not working, then yes, we would revisit it. But with the greatest respect to John or any other borough commander that makes that recommendation, we need to follow due process in terms of determining whether the training has worked or not.
Sir, it's 4:20.
Yes.
The next matter I wish to turn to, I won't get done in 10 minutes. I'm mindful it's been a long day also for Mr. Brown, and it may
Yes.
be useful to start at a logical starting point first thing tomorrow morning.
Well, I don't suppose Mr. Brown would object to an early afternoon. How are you getting on with his examination? I mean,
In time-wise,
yes, just as a general indication, can he hope to be free tomorrow?
yes.
Can he put his hopes high?
I would never wish to overestimate anyone's hopes in terms of time management here, but I'm confident that Mr. Brown's examination will be complete tomorrow.
Yes, well, that's very helpful because I think he'd like to know that. Well, Mr. Brown, it is slightly earlier than usual, but I think we'll stop at that point for the day. I'm going to have to ask you to come back to continue tomorrow but I think you were expecting that. But it sounds as though you can hope to finish tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you very much indeed. We'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, please. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it
Thank you very
while
much.
you're away. All right? Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, you could go with the usher, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Kinnear. Well, 10 o'clock tomorrow then.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.